Today, the secret meaning in Plato's dialogues, the weird math in the Republic, and the spacey dream logic of the myth of Ur. I'm Cliff Mark, and this is Good in Theory. Today's episode is going to be slightly different than usual. I've got a guest. He knows a lot about Plato. We're going to talk about that, and that's not out of the ordinary. But he takes a very different approach to Plato than I do. Earl Fontainelle is the creator of a podcast called The Secret History of Western Esotericism, or the SHWEP. And in that podcast, he refers to Plato as the father of Western esotericism. He may have changed his mind about that. We'll get into it. But that leaves us with the question, what is esotericism? It's different from philosophy. Usually, philosophers, especially nowadays, they try to understand the explicit things that people say in their texts. We analyze arguments that are on the surface, right? What did Plato say? Or in Plato's case, it's a little bit complicated, so we might ask, what does Socrates say? But esotericism, that's all about secret messages hidden within texts that are meant only for the initiated. So think of the Da Vinci Code or Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, or one of my favorites, the Illuminatus trilogy. And it may seem strange on a theory and philosophy podcast to bring an approach that seems more adjacent to the occult and conspiracies. But actually, it's not that strange. Because as Earl will point out, there are plenty of clues that there's more going on in the Republic than is apparent on the surface. And as a matter of fact, for most of history, most readers of Plato assumed that he was writing esoterically. So we'll be talking today about the esoteric reading of Plato in general, and the esoteric reading of the Republic in particular. In particular, I'm going to ask him about math. Because if you remember the Republic series, you'll remember that some of the most puzzling passages in the book happen when Socrates comes out with some weirdly precise mathematical argument. There's the divided line, there's the complicated baby math that governs the eugenics program in the City and Speech, and there's the argument towards the end that the philosopher is exactly 729 times happier than the tyrant. I'm going to ask Earl about all of these puzzles and more. We go on for a pretty long time, and we get into some kind of obscure stuff, but it's all fascinating. So, without further delay, Earl Fontainelle of the SHWEP, the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast. Welcome to Good in Theory. First off, I want to say I am a fan of the SHWEP. The scholarship is great. The music, which we just played, is excellent. And the whole podcast has a kind of mysterious mood to it, which I really dig. So, could we just start off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and the project?
I'm a para-academic historian of ideas. I'm working on this thing, the SHWEP, which is a chronological exploration of this historical field of complex interrelated currents, which people talk about under the rubric of Western esotericism. And it's this sort of stupidly long-term project. It's been going on almost 4 years now. We're in the 3rd century CE, and the end point is, I guess it'll be like the year 2030 or whatever when the project is done, and we'll bring it right up to date and then call it a day or a decade.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. So what is Western esotericism? It is a concept that's been partly invented by esotericists themselves, but it's been taken on by scholarship, and it's somewhat artificial, but also does apply to historically recognizable things that really happened and beliefs that people really had. And scholars will always disagree about, firstly, what Western means, secondly, what they mean by esotericism, but thirdly, also just exactly what we're supposed to include in this. But if you've ever read Francis Yates, or if you've ever read Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, which is kind of a satire reception of, a loving satire reception of Western esotericism, that's the kind of territory we're talking about.
So, secret messages, historical mysteries, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In the podcast, I think you give a sort of tentative definition of esotericism as the practice of writing something that's hidden to most audiences, but is specifically for a particular audience, and only they will understand it.
Yes. Well, I'll give you, I have a working definition, and
Great.
There's two things that we consider for esotericism. The first is not just writing, but a speech act in which the information being given is represented as being only for an initiated elite of some kind, and B is knowledge of a qualitatively higher type. So the first part, the represented part, is key, because sometimes people publish things like that famous New Age book, The Secret. Have you come across that?
Yeah, of course, but I haven't read it though.
It's this cheesy New Age book, and it's called The Secret. So you think, oh, it's a secret, but the thing's been published, sold 10 million copies. It's been published
Right.
in 40 languages. Whatever it is, it ain't a secret, right? So that's an example of the rhetoric of esotericism, and it's higher knowledge. So it's not just a secret like, a computer password. It's a secret. It's knowledge that's been given by God or by divine mediators, or through a state of enlightenment. In the case of Buddhism, it's qualitatively higher knowledge. So that's the esoteric. Now, the other thing you want to talk about is the actual practice of social esotericism, practice of exclusion. And this does exist. So you get, for example, Freemasonry. This is a famous example that everyone knows. The Masons don't allow just anyone in. You have to become a member. You have to be invited. Then you become a member. Then you learn the secrets. The secrets have all been published. That doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is the kind of enactment of social esotericism. The ancient mystery cults is another well-known example.
So it still counts as a mystery if everyone knows the mysteries, they've been published, but you still go and you do the rituals?
I'd say so. It certainly fits my definition of the esoteric, right? We have a lot of evidence, for example, that the Eleusinian mysteries, which is the mysteries that for the ancients and for Plato were the kind of gold standard by which all mysteries should be judged, because they were the Athenian cult.
Right.
We have a lot of evidence that the secrets, if there were secrets, were revealed on numerous occasions in public. And this was a criminal offense to do this. You could get punished for it, but it happened. So it's like, if we're really talking about secrecy, the secret's out. Sorry, guys. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something performative.
Right. So you call Plato the father of Western esotericism.
Yeah. In doing the podcast, my thinking on this has changed. I would now call him the grandfather of Western esotericism.
Okay.
Because he's not really Western. He's pre-Western, if that makes sense. The West, I think the West as a meaningful historiographical construct doesn't yet exist in Plato's time.
He might not be Western yet, but he still may have fathered Western esotericism, or at least grandfathered it. Why do you think that? So what are the signs that Plato is hiding messages for an initiated crowd that is of a higher order?
I see what you're saying. So I'll get to that in a second, but
Yeah.
the reason for him being the grandfather of Western esotericism isn't just that. It's not just because he exercises the esoteric, if he does. It's also because he is, in many ways, the father of macrocosm, microcosm construction of the human self and the cosmos. He's the father of the immaterial, immortal soul which reincarnates. He's the father of a intangible, invisible world, which is sort of separate from our world of everyday coming to be, but which is intimately connected to and indeed is the foundation of our world. So this idea of thinking about forms, thinking about underlying realities, which runs right through Western esotericism in a lot of ways. Not in all cases, like the alchemists, for example, that's a different kind of stream. But do you see what I mean? So it's his ideas.
Right. So like, even if Plato isn't writing esoterically himself, his ideas and the themes that he talks about, like the forms and stuff, that inspires esotericists that come after him.
Yeah, so those themes I've just given are some ones that are really important right through. Yeah, and you'll see this in esoteric currents in the Abrahamic traditions in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where you have mainstream Christianity. God creates the world. Simple. There's God. There's the world. And then you keep seeing these little movements popping up here and there that are talking about forms as ideas in the mind of God. And God doesn't just create the world. First, the forms exist, and then you have this sort of emanatory cosmology. So this is like a kind of Platonistic strand within Christianity that keeps popping up, and it often is expressed through more esoteric currents of Christianity. Now, maybe that's not what you want to talk about. You want to talk about was Plato writing esoterically, right?
Yeah.
Interestingly, the majority reading of Plato from the 1st century BCE, at least, if not earlier, until the 19th century. So the vast majority of people reading Plato have read him as an esoteric author, including the Platonists themselves. So the idea that he isn't an esoteric author is modern. Everyone up until recently has assumed that he is. And you can even talk about writing in the Platonic mode, modo platonico in Latin. And that means writing with a secret hidden meaning, subtext.
Huh. That is so interesting that for most of history, writing in the Platonic way means writing esoterically. And with that in mind, I'd like to get on to the Republic, because I did a 13-part series on the Republic. It is an adaptation. There's commentary. It's pretty in-depth for a podcast, but still, even in that amount of time, I can only really sail across the surface of the book. I get a bit into interpretation, but I certainly didn't get into the deeper, esoteric, possibly hidden meanings of the book. And you are obviously just the guy to tell us about that. So without saying for sure what Plato himself might have been doing, why do his readers think that the Republic might have more to it than is on the surface?
Okay, well, there's the first reason, which is that a lot of people think everything in Plato has more to it than is on the surface, which we've just talked about.
Right.
Secondly, and you know, that's not a crazy standpoint. Let me just say this. In the analytic study of Plato, it's seen as a bit of a fringe position, especially in the Anglo-American world. It isn't crazy, guys. Plato is choosing to write these aporetic dialogues that intentionally mess with your head, right?
Yes.
It sometimes seems to me that even if he wasn't writing esoterically, in the sense we've talked about, he's doing his damnedest to make you think he's writing esoterically. Do you see what I mean?
Okay.
Like he's vexing us on purpose and leaving stuff open-ended on purpose. So we have to at least deal with that in some way. Okay, let's talk about the Republic specifically. You know, we have, going back to antiquity, we have lots of commentaries on the Republic. Proclus's being one of the, probably, I'm going to say the longest that survives. I could be wrong about that. But we have an enormous commentary by Proclus, the late Platonist, on the Republic, and he preserves loads of people's opinions on the Republic. And it's very clear from Proclus and also the tradition that he's drawing on that in antiquity, not only did everyone think this dialogue was absolutely chock full of hidden meanings and crazy symbols and weird structural games,
right.
But if you read it, you kind of think, I think there must be something in this. That's my reading anyway. Now then, there's a.
Let me ask you this question about
specifically. Yeah.
Just about the idea that Plato is vexing us on purpose, or is writing these open-ended, confusing dialogues. Yeah. Now, I think it is quite obvious that he's provoking aporia. They are confusing. They are open-ended, and you can't solve them. So I wouldn't try to guess that Plato has this like very clear, explicit message. They are confusing, but they might be. What is the difference between them being confusing in the sense that we don't know a Shakespeare's message, right, or the message of a certain film, and esotericism, where there's actually like this higher order hidden meaning? Whereas there might not be in a play, right? It's just the art is the interplay of all these confusing different strands of thought.
Yeah. What's the difference between those two? It would be, I guess, in Plato's intention, which we can never truly access. However, I would say that as a thought experiment, straightforward philosophic prose, just saying this is what I think, definitely existed by Plato's time. Aristotle wrote it in a extremely dry and grueling fashion, and many people before him did as well. That was an option on the table, and Plato didn't choose it. Why?
Right. Well, I mean, maybe because he thought it was more stimulating to write plays. So I guess what I'm saying is, why do you think that he's doing esotericism instead of just like being a playwright?
I'm agnostic about it. I study the Platonist tradition. So I'm studying.
Why do the Platonists think that then?
Why did they think it? We don't know. Well, we do know for some, we have two explicit statements of why Plato wrote esoterically in Platonists. So Plutarch, writing in the 1st century, says he did it basically for reasons of philosophic elitism, so as not to cast pearls before swine, paraphrasing, right? Which is something that appears in Plato as well. He does talk about this, like in Sophist, for example. He says, you can't just throw philosophy out in front of anyone because they're going to just sort of like get it mucky. And in the Republic, he talks about, definitely not everyone is going to be a philosopher, right? There is an elite. And
absolutely,
in Numenius of Apamea, a personal favorite of mine in the 2nd century CE, he has a wonderful bit in one of his fragments where he says, why did Plato write esoterically? He did it because he saw what happened to Socrates. Right. Or, basically stating uncomfortable truths to power. What happens? You have to drink the hemlock. Therefore, Plato hid himself by writing between clarity and obscurity, which is a very interesting way of putting it. So those are the only two explicit reasons for Plato's sort of choice to write esoterically found in Platonism that I'm aware of. And the second one is clearly fully in line with Leo Strauss's reading, right? It's Straussian esotericism. You write unclearly on purpose. It keeps the herd away because they can't really get what you're doing because they're not philosophical and they don't have the time and the energy. But then the truly philosophical student is going to find it. And they're the ones who aren't going to try to poison you with hemlock for saying uncomfortable truths because they're philosophers. So everyone's safe. You can publish openly, but esoterically, using this sort of Straussian methodology.
Right. And so to get to the Republic.
Yeah. Let me just say one more thing about the Republic. There's a report in antiquity. This is getting back to what you said earlier about why should we think the Republic is full of esoteric stuff. There's a report in antiquity that Plato, upon his death, they found a bunch of wax tablets on which he'd rewritten and rewritten the opening line of the Republic over and over.
I
So
love this.
now this is probably not literally true for various reasons, but I think what it bespeaks is an understanding on the part of the reading public that Plato, like nothing in the Republic, is accidental. It's so finely tuned and constructed with such care, such like ridiculous self-referential structural care, that it has to, every word has to be weighed. So the fact that it starts with the word kateben, I went down, and it has this whole series of ascent and descent motifs throughout the whole thing, and then it ends with the myth of where he goes down and then he comes up again. This is all on purpose, and obviously the ascent and descent themes play into the divided line, the cave, which you've talked about, I'm sure, on your podcast.
Yes,
so,
right.
So this is all on purpose, and it gets. In a minute, we're going to talk about the mathematical stuff, I'm sure, and then we'll see more of like this kind of structural stuff in action and what he's doing with it.
Well, yeah, just when you were talking about how carefully this is constructed, down to the word, to the syllable, that I think is a great segue into the first passage in Republic that I want to talk to you about, which is the analogy of the divided line.
Yeah.
So just to remind the listeners, this is from Book 6 in the Republic, and for Good in Theory, it's in the Part 9 of the Republic series, Horny for the Good. And in this part of the story, Socrates and the boys have planned out the city, and they've put the Philosopher Kings in charge, and now they're talking about how to educate the Philosopher Kings. And then Socrates gets into these 3 really famous metaphors, which are the sun, the line, and the cave. And so the sun is, Socrates is talking about what the Philosopher Kings will be studying. He talks about the form of the good, which is this transcendent, beautiful thing that's realer than everything else and lends reality and truth to everything else. So I find the sun a really vivid image. And the last one is the cave, which is also another really vivid metaphor. But in the middle, he drops in the divided line. And he pays a lot of attention to it. It's supposed to be very important, but to me, reading this as an undergrad, it was always so much less memorable and evocative than the sun and the cave. So maybe you could just bring us through what the divided line is on the surface and how that links into some of these hidden meanings and patterns that people have found in the Republic.
Yeah, so that's a great example for this kind of structural stuff, which can be read as intentional esotericism or intentional just ridiculous craftsmanship on Plato's part, or it can be read in other ways. The divided line, Socrates says, and Socrates is expressing this with what seems to be intense irony to Glaucon, and saying, like you still don't understand, Glaucon? Let me put it to you this way. This will explain things. And then he comes with the divided line, and Glaucon's kind of like, thanks for that explanation, Socrates, which is something you've brought out nicely in your podcast, this sort of where Glaucon is kind of saying, oh yeah, that's very clear, Socrates, but it's quite obvious.
Totally unclear.
It's not clear. So, before we even get into the divided line, let's just say with all these things that are sometimes referred to as the mathematical puzzles of the Republic, they are surely, in my interpretation, made to make the reader work and maybe draw a diagram and try to nut it out and do some geometry and mathematics while reading or while having it read to you, because it was probably recited in its initial Athenian context, right? That in itself could be seen as a bit of Straussian esotericism. So if you're Cornford, for example, Francis MacDonald Cornford, the translator of Plato's Republic, who does a very serviceable translation into English, you skip these bits, not the divided line, it's too essential to skip, but you skip the nuptial number and the number of the tyrant, which we'll talk about in a minute, because you just can't see what possible relevance they have to the text as a whole. That's because you're not the initiated elite, Francis Cornford. So
you can't just make sense of it, so
Yeah.
you're afraid your translation is wrong.
Which is,
I mean, look, I got to say, I have at least some sympathy for that feeling.
Me too.
When encountering these passages.
well, when we talk about these passages, you
Yeah.
will see that I too am not of the philosophical elite. I can at least be in aporia, maybe in an educated way, but I'm not out of my aporia about these passages. But the divided line is a line that shall be divided. I'm going to paraphrase Socrates here and tell me if I'm getting everything, all the essentials. It's a line that shall be divided according to a certain ratio into two pieces. Then each of those pieces will again be divided by the same ratio, giving us 4 segments of line.
Mm-hmm.
Now, each of these segments will correspond to a certain type of human cognition, and each type of cognition will have its appropriate objects of cognition. So the lowest one is eikasia, which is sometimes translated as conjecture. It's a term that Plato has basically coined for the ad hoc for this passage, which is normal practice for him. Mm-hmm. It's like a kind of shadowy knowledge of secondary artificial things. So it's like a bit like the shadows, knowledge of the shadows in the cave.
Right.
Then you go up, and and it's very much an up and down thing. Now the top 2 tiers of the divided line are episteme, scientific knowledge, or knowledge of, well, it's usually translated as scientific knowledge, not in the sort of modern term of science, but in terms of a body of knowledge based on proven axioms that is based on sort of deduction. It's not just purely guesswork. And the highest one, which all the commentators want to say applies to noesis, this very peculiar Greek term, but Socrates doesn't come out and say that. He just kind of says, oh, and the highest one, I can't really express it to you, tell you what it is. Let's move on. So another piece of what might be Platonist esotericism there. Anyway, that is knowledge of the forms, or rather, that is doing the forms, encountering the forms directly. No possibility of error, because the forms are right there and you're right there with them, and you're encountering reality in its most naked form, right?
Yeah, and that's the largest section of the line.
Well, you tell me. No one can decide. Socrates certainly doesn't say that. Socrates never says which ones are the highest and the lowest. And Brumbaugh, in his book Plato's Mathematical Imagination, which is a very in-depth investigation of all of these things in Plato, which I highly recommend to anyone, but don't think that by reading it you're going to come out with the solution to any of these things. He points out that this idea that biggest must be best is actually a really modern way of approaching the line. And for the Pythagoreans, it's the lower numbers that are the most important. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. Who cares about, 5,862? So the idea that the biggest part of the line is going to be the best part is maybe exactly the opposite of what Plato meant. The fact is, we don't know from the text which is the biggest bit and which is the smallest bit.
Do we not know which is the biggest bit or which is the smallest bit, or do we not know if biggest means important, or we don't know either?
We don't know either. For
Wonderful.
Sure. Socrates doesn't
because
say.
Everyone's drawing the same diagrams, in all the translations.
I know, and it's silly. Now, if you ask me, and this is... So Socrates doesn't really tell us what the ratio... He says there's a ratio. It's really important that you use this ratio. And just like in the Timaeus, it's important. It's clear that ratios are really important to Plato. Now, we can look at this discussion of music in the Republic and see maybe where he's coming from on that, right? Because his music theory is based on whole number harmonic ratios, right? Pythagorean, so-called Pythagorean music theory. So 5/4, 1/2, that's your octave, all this kind of stuff, right?
Right.
This
is the other parts of the Republic over years and years. I just kind of skimmed over because I'm like, I do not know modern music, much less ancient Greek music.
Yeah. Like with astronomy. So astronomy and music theory are both really important for education of the ruling class in the Republic, right? Why are they important and how are they to be done? Well, they're not to be done. For example, astronomy is not to be done, Socrates tells us, by actually stargazing, because then things get messy. What we have to do is a kind of perfect mathematical astronomy, whereby the messiness of reality is not there and you have some kind of pure mathematical.
We want astronomy without stars and music without sound, harmony without sound.
There you go. So it may be that that's where he's coming from with this ratio business. There's other possibilities, but
the divided line is in a specific ratio.
It must be, but what is that ratio? No, I personally have no doubt that the ratio in question is the so-called phi in modern mathematics, also widely known as the golden section or the golden mean, which is a ratio of 1 to 1.618033, blah, blah, repeating. It's an irrational number that repeats forever. Now, this ratio has some certain qualities which make it very interesting. It appears in nature all the time. It appears in the way living things grow. It appears in shells. It appears in, like in nature. It's just the way it's sort of fundamental to the way organisms grow. But it also has mathematical properties. Have you talked about the golden section at all in your podcast yet?
I did not.
Okay, cool. So I'll just quickly talk about it.
Get into it.
It's the only way to divine a line whereby the short, let's say you divide a line you have a line AC, and you divide it at B such that AB is the short piece, it's 1, and BC is 1.618. That is the only possible way of dividing a line, such that AB is to BC as BC is to AC. In other words, that the short piece is to the large piece as the large piece is to the whole.
Okay, I'm going to put a diagram of this in the show notes, but this is the ratio of the divided line we're saying.
That's my guess, and
that's what we think.
Why should we think that? Well, it's got to be a pretty important ratio for Plato to be going on about it. And as Maya Alapin's recent PhD thesis, the philosophical implications of interpreting Plato through musical analysis, University of New Mexico 2021, has shown without a shadow of a doubt, because she does quantitative number crunching digital analysis of the text, if you were to take the entire text of the Republic and stretch it out as Greek letters with no spaces between them, right? So it's a line, in other words.
One giant line of text.
One giant line of text, and you were to divide it exactly at the golden cut of that text, that cut would fall precisely within the discussion of the divided line.
This is reminding me of that movie Pi that came out in the 90s. This is some very serious, mysterious stuff. So, just to clarify, we're talking about a divided line that we think that Socrates is describing. Yeah. It's divided in a specific ratio. Now, if we turn the text of the entire Republic into one line of letters, a giant string of letters, you're saying that the cut in the divided line, the discussion of divided line happens in the same place as a line divided in that ratio would be, like if the text was divided in that line.
Yeah, if you were to divide the line according to the golden section, the cut would fall kind of in the middle of the discussion of the divided line. Not right at the beginning, like right in the middle. There, for sure. So
that's wild.
Is that an accident? Some people would just say, yeah, it's an accident. Who knows? But
it's a hell of an accident.
It's a hell of an accident, isn't it? Especially in a piece of writing which is famous in antiquity for being the one that Plato took the most time in writing and rewriting and structuring, right? So we should expect, if we expect anywhere in Plato to have something like this, this is the dialogue to expect it in. And actually Plato does stuff like this in lots of dialogues. So I think there's a strong reason to think about the golden section. The golden section is something that we know the Egyptians and in a geometric way used and knew about. We know that Near Eastern peoples knew about in a more mathematical, like arithmetical way. But we also know that the Greeks found irrational numbers hard to deal with. and maybe even kind of unholy in the Pythagorean context. But it's really hard to get back to what the Pythagoreans really thought about this stuff. It's all kind of lore. But certainly these kinds of important mathematical structures that had really interesting qualities, like the Platonic solids that are discussed in the Timaeus. Plato's really interested in these, right? Really interested in them. So why he brings up this divided line as a kind of model for consciousness or cognition, right, I don't know. But it's very clear that for Socrates in the Republic, it's really important that it has to be this line with a certain ratio, and he's clearly inviting us to figure out what the ratio is. I think the golden section is the obvious candidate, the obvious standout candidate. What else would it be? I mean, I certainly can't think of any other obvious candidate for what this ratio might be. Although, why would there be an obvious candidate?
Right. What I'm saying is, but let's say that is the ratio.
Yeah.
But then from what else? How does that change our reading of the Republic?
Good question.
Except to say, oh, he's done this really neat trick.
Yeah. I don't know. Mm-hmm. That to answer that question would be to answer, why does Plato think geometry is so important?
Yeah.
And I don't know. Socrates tells us some stuff about why geometry is going to be important for education of the rulers. But it has to do with the harmonies of the soul, right? And it has it has to do with
and that's
music.
All also as mysterious as the geometry stuff.
Yeah. The soul has to be made musical. So what does that mean exactly? Okay, we have to get back into a certain understanding of music, which is, I mean, it's often called Pythagorean, but that's ahistorical. But let's call it based on whole number ratios, not based on actually playing the guitar, but based on perfect whole number ratios in a kind of idealized scale system. And
when he's giving the curriculum, right, and describing the study of music and astrology and all that, he's saying, well, look, you don't want to have all these people looking silly, torturing their strings and holding their ears up to sounding boards, right? We're not in the harmony for the sound. We're into harmony for the perfect proportions.
Yeah. And the soul itself seems to be something that is proportional, right?
Right.
Here in the Republic, it's the threefold soul, of course, but also in the Timaeus, when the demiurge constructs the soul stuff into the cosmos, he does it according to this ratio that's expressed in the famous Platonic lambda diagram. And there's a lot of ratio stuff going on here, which is not the relevance of which to Plato's philosophy is not obvious, at least not to a modern.
Let me try out my very lazy theory on you.
Please do.
Which is that I totally buy that there are these sort of mysterious mathematical patterns, and that there are these puzzles that Plato is, teasing us and making us do the work and trying purposely to vex us. I completely agree with that. But then the question is why? And this is why I've been pressing you on, like, what is the deeper meaning? Once we know this, once we've seen part of the answer to this puzzle or think that we have, what else does it tell us? And if the answer is nothing, then he might just be putting brain teasers in the work just because he likes brain teasers. And it may be that, like, there's puzzles here, and there's a solution to them, and they're a fun little, like, side quest when you're reading the book or hearing it recited, but it might not bear on, like, a deep message of wisdom or necessarily a change in what we might overall think is the, like, ethical message of the Republic, whatever we think it is.
I see what you're saying. I don't think it's fair to assume that the ethical message is the main message of the Republic.
Right.
Or of Plato, even though everyone talks about the Socratic turn toward ethics in Greek philosophy. Here's why I think that. Are you familiar with the testimony to the lecture on the good?
Yes, but please refresh everyone.
So
who's
there's a
listening.
student, we have testimony from Aristotle and one of his students that Plato gave this lecture. And this is also at the heart of the whole esotericism debate, because it's so weird, this historical report, that it's hard to know what the hell to make of it. But allegedly, he announced there was going to be a lecture in Athens on the good. And everyone came, like just kind of all comers, right? It's just an open lecture.
Right, public lecture.
And he baffled everyone because they all came, this is what Aristotle says, they all came thinking they were going to hear something about, sort of the good in the normal Greek sense of the term, like
how to make money, family,
or how
success
should
in politics.
We live? How should we live? How do you get eudaimonia? How do you live a blessed life? Which is something that, everyone is really interested in this period from Socrates onwards. And instead of that, what they got was the good is one and a bunch of mathematics. And so
Plato.
I think that Plato, in some way that I definitely do not claim to understand, and which may indeed change over time, because I'm not a unitary reader of Plato. I think reading Plato for a unitary message is to take the example you gave earlier. It's like reading Shakespeare for a unitary message, expecting him always to say the same thing. Probably not a clever way of reading a dramatist, but you can certainly read him as someone who has some themes that he's really interested in. And I think he has some kind of mathematical esoteric ontology and metaphysics. Like he really thinks that numbers are somehow deeply related to the structure of reality. And he's exploring that. And so when he says the good is one, he's not, I mean, that's like he's like dropping a bomb. And then everyone goes, right, Plato, you're nuts, and walks out. And he's like, this proves what I was always thinking, that, very few are suited to be true philosophers, and then kind of walks off in a huff or whatever. But so I think that's what's going on. I think that's what's going on with the one, or with the form of the good in the Republic, which doesn't seem to make any sense if we're trying to look for like an ethics of goodness. I mean, all kinds of analytic philosophers read this and they say, like this is a practical ethic, and this is how you would live it, and you would always have reference to the good. But like he's talking about something that transcends all knowledge. It's epikena tesousias. It's beyond essence. It can't be cognized in any way. What the hell is it? Right? Well, it's one.
And well, it's it's just funny because Socrates says to Glaucon, right, like listen, I can't really explain this to you, you wouldn't get it. And then there's this lecture that Plato gives, and he says, okay, I'll explain it to you. And then at the end, see, I told you, you didn't get it. Right?
Yeah. Now, what's the chronology? Did the Republic come out first and then the lecture on the good happen? Did the lecture on the good happen, then the Republic come out? Yeah. No one knows. Why the hell Plato would have given this lecture in public when he has all these, if he's supposed to be this esoteric guy who doesn't cast pearls before swine, that's just a complete question beggar that is, every time you think you know what's going on, it's kind of poking you in the eye and going, oh yeah, what about this? So it's a really tough one to make sense of. But anyway, for what it's worth, that's my feeling on Plato. I'm, sort of agnostic about pretty much everything Plato is actually trying to say, but I do get the sense that he has this really deep obsession stroke interest in the relationship between mathematical realities and the rest of reality.
Right. Okay.
So in ethics,
I mean, I think, like, again, I see that, but then I don't know what to make of it, because maybe I just don't know enough about math and ancient Greek music.
Maybe you need to do a 40-year education devoted to, kind of step-by-step introduction to these disciplines, and then you would maybe be able to see the form. I feel like
the stories I heard in childhood have already ruined my soul, so I'm not sure it's worth the 30-year investment in solid geometry and so on.
Yeah, we've missed the window.
Let me ask you then about a couple of other of these mathematical things. So, as I came across some of them, I did know enough that I think Plato was being quite precise in his numbers. So I kept a lot of these specifics in the podcast, but I didn't go deeply into the interpretation for, all of the big questions that we're talking about now, which is that, look, if I'm doing half an hour-long episodes and I'm trying to get through a book or so of Republic, this is a deep rabbit hole to fall down.
Yeah.
So I'd like to play you a couple of clips from the podcast, and maybe I'll tell you what we said in the podcast, and maybe you can shed any other insight that you might have on them. So the first one is the nuptial number clip. And so this is book 8 of the Republic. It's our episode called Degenerate Cities, Degenerate Souls. And Glaucon and Socrates, they're discussing why the regime's degenerate. Glaucon's asking, we designed this perfect regime. Why would it ever get worse? And this is Socrates' explanation.
Sounds good, Socrates. But how does our perfect regime fall apart? Shouldn't it last forever?
Nothing lasts forever, Glaucon. When the regime changes, it's probably because the rulers start making mistakes in their calculations for breeding new citizens.
What do you mean?
You know that for the birth of a divine being, you need a period of a perfect number.
Sure. And for a human?
For that, you need to take the first number where the power of roots combined with squares, with 3 dimensions and 4 defining limits, of the numbers which create likeness and unlikeness and which wax and wane, make all things conversable and rational with one another.
Uh-huh.
Of these, the ones that form the basis of the musical fourth, when coupled with 5 and 3 times increase, produce 2 harmonies. The first harmony is a square, the product of equals, so many times 100. The second harmony is of equal length one way, but a rectangle. One side is the square of a rational diagonal of a 5 by 5 square minus 2 times 100. The other side is 3 cubed times 100. Taken as a whole, this geometrical number is what controls better and worse births.
Of course. Everybody knows that.
Yes, they do, but the calculations still aren't easy. And when the guardians don't get the baby math perfect, the babies aren't perfect.
I love how you put that together. You've captured beautifully what I think is doubtless intentional comedy of that scene.
Yeah.
Where he's like, "Oh yes, of course, that's perfectly clear, Socrates."
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
I don't think anyone can follow that. That's why.
Yeah.
That's why I found that funny, but also puzzling, because I knew it jumps out at you as something.
No one can
difficult to
follow that for a number of reasons. One, mathematical terminology, like the terminology for arithmetic, like saying odd and even, add and subtract and stuff like that, isn't standard in Plato's time yet. So first of all, you don't always know what he means when he says, like, is he saying the square of, or is he saying the harmonic progression of, these kind of questions. Secondly, the text is almost certainly corrupt to some degree. And the reason we know this, because all of Plato has been transmitted through sort of curated by Byzantine medieval scriptoria, and lots of errors crept in. But if you don't really know the terminology, it's hard to correct the text, because he's saying hekatos or hekastos in this particular passage and this sort of thing. And thirdly, we have lots of scholia to this. This, and also the number of the tyrant passage from different manuscripts, which is, people explaining what they think Plato means, and no one agrees on it. There's tons of different, and including among the Platonists, tons of different construals of what the number is supposed to be. Now, Brumbaugh, in Plato's mathematical imagination, takes the 3-4-5 thing to be referring to the 3-4-5 triangle, which is, of course, brings us to the famous Pythagorean theorem, which isn't Pythagorean and which was known about at least hundreds of years before Pythagoras in the Near East. That can be demonstrated, but there is something special about this triangle because it's a whole number triangle, right triangle, and as we know from geometry class, Pythagoras' theorem tells us that the 3 and 4 sides squared and added together will be the same number as the square of the hypotenuse, which is the 5. And there's this whole thing about the Pythagoreans having called 5 the number of marriage because it marries the 3 and the 4. And so that's why Plato's referring to this, but all our evidence for this Pythagorean saying is extremely late, comes way after Pythagoreanism. So I don't know what the hell's going on in this passage. And I don't think we even necessarily can establish a text. There have been lots of attempts to decode the right. The idea is that and yeah, it just says a bunch of stuff that I find quite unintelligible about Plato's, because Plato's talking about maybe genetics here, right? He's talking about how human bloodlines kind of decay over time and how it's impossible to predict exactly what the good strain is going to be. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's more the latter than the former, right? So the gloss I gave on it in the podcast is that, look, this is obviously very complicated and we don't have a solid text for it and nobody agrees, but we do know for sure that it's really difficult. And so what he might be saying is that it's impossibly difficult to actually in practice run a perfect eugenics program, because you're not going to be able to predict ahead of time, which will make good births.
I think it's safe to say that's one of the things that he is definitely saying, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to avoid the idea that he really thinks that the numbers themselves are significant. And what those are...
that's why I'm like, is it Sudoku for Sudoku's sake? or what's going on here?
Yeah. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I don't have the answer. So,
okay.
Well,
then let me play you one more. And this is one of my favorite number things in Plato, because I used to even use this as a bonus question on exams. But this is when, in Book 9, Glaucon and Socrates are talking about the life of the tyrant and how unhappy he would be. And so they get into how you're going to be really happy if your soul listens to reason, but if you let one of the other kinds of desires, like spirit or your appetites, take charge, then you're going to be unhappy. And then they get into how much happier is the philosopher than the tyrant. Here's a clip.
And that's why the tyrant is so unhappy. He's got the wildest desires.
Exactly. And do you know how much less happy the tyrant is?
No. Tell me.
It's simple. There are 3 kinds of pleasures, and the tyrant is at the third remove from the oligarchic man, and the oligarchic man is at the third remove from the king, which puts the tyrant at 3 times 3 removes from true pleasure. So based on the number of its length, the phantom of the tyrant's pleasure would be a plane, so the square and the cube show us the exact difference.
It sure does. It's, a lot?
It's 729, Glaucon. The king lives 729 times more pleasantly than the tyrant.
Wow, that is a lot.
Beautiful.
And yeah, simple, right?
Yeah. Again, nicely done. Bravo. You bring out the comedy very well. So what do we make of that number? Do you have any theories?
No, it's a lot. This is another one that just it's stuck in my brain because it was so aggressively and flamboyantly incomprehensible.
Yeah. Now, one thing that is, I think, certainly going on here is some kind of astral thing. And the reason
that was my next guess.
The reason I think that is because, well, we know that Plato is really interested in astronomy, and nowhere is that better shown than in the Republic. Mm-hmm. And astronomy is just a fledgling science in Greece in his time. They're absorbing all this new knowledge from the Near East, centuries and even millennia of astral observations and stuff like this, and kind of crunching the numbers and coming up with this new science and trying to model things mathematically. Mm-hmm. Plato's definitely concerned with that project, right? And we have tons of evidence that I won't get into about that. And 729 is 364 and a half plus 364 and a half. So in other words, the number of days and nights in a year. And why do we think that that would have any significance? Because right at the end of the passage, Socrates says something like, so this is obvious, right, Glaucon? And Glaucon responds, it's as obvious. Well, he says something like, it's as clear as night and day would be a good English translation. But actually he says something more along the lines of, this is clearly true as long as day and night and months and weeks and years hold sway over mankind, or something like that. So he makes a reference to time as a kind of astral phenomenon, as, you know, something that's marked out by the movement of, well, the stars and planets, what we would call the movement of the earth. And so that reference makes it very clear that we're supposed to look toward time. And this value happens to have the exact value of a year, nights and days in a year, right? So that's clearly some part of it. But what that means is another question.
Right. Well, so I mean, this is why I'm loath to say I have any theories, because I've read the 729, the number of days and nights in a year. I'm like, okay, cool, interesting. I'm like, but what is it? What else does it tell me except that there's like, it just points to this entire kind of below surface mathematical subtext that I can't fully get to grips with. It just like it hints that it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. That's my position as well. That's my considered position. I have no idea what he's on about.
Well, you know, look, I guess over the years we've come some distance from not knowing what he's on about to like knowing that you don't know what he's on and still don't know.
Maybe that brings us to the second level of knowledge that Socrates talks about in the Apology, right? It's not just pure ignorance, it's knowledge that you don't know. So it's a kind of informed knowledge of your ignorance, which is better
known unknowns, as we had from another epistemologist.
Yeah, well, maybe a slightly lower grade epistemologist. So yeah, I think that's where any safe bet is in Platonic interpretation, is in the we at least can kind of intelligently say, I have no idea what he's on about. And I would go so far as to say he's on about something astronomical. And because of the hints in the text, because of these like kind of playful hints about the days and nights and that kind of thing.
Do we know a lot about Greek astronomy? Are there scholars out there who are like experts in Greek astronomy and puzzling this together? I'm sure there must be.
Yeah, absolutely. We know much less than we would like to know, largely because so much is lost, but we really do know a lot. We don't know, for example, we don't know how the exact mechanisms of knowledge transfer from the Near East to Greece, of all this astronomical, observational knowledge. But we know it happened for sure. What happened? We know Plato's interested in it. We know Plato's associates, Aristotle and Eudoxus of Cnidos, both put forth mathematical models of the cosmos that kind of work for observational prediction and stuff like that. We know Plato's interested in that problem, and indeed in the myth of which I don't know if you've talked about this, but one of the really weird bits about the myth of and that's already saying something, right? Because the myth of is very weird. Is traveling in this plane with all these souls, which are dead people who are on their way to being given the next lot, their next incarnation, basically. They're sort of traveling through this other world.
So just as a refresher for the listener, the myth of is the closing myth of the entire Republic that Socrates tells to Glaucon. It's the one about the afterlife. Sorry, go on, Earl. They're about to choose their next life.
Yeah. Well, here's another example of where, you know, he is ostensibly giving a kind of myth with an ethical message, which is like something along the lines of, you fundamentally are responsible for your lot in life, and virtue is its own reward, and those who live virtuously will be rewarded for it with a better
the actions
fate.
You choose determine the person you become.
Yeah. And he is saying that, but he's also saying some crazy astrogeometrical weirdness, because as they're walking along, they see in the distance this giant kind of rainbow column, and it's all very kind of psychedelic, and you don't know where
Yeah.
they are. They're supposed to be in the traditional underworld, but it's very suddenly they're not anymore. And they keep walking, and they come to this place where they see the spindle of heaven, which is a spindle. You have to think of an ancient Greek spindle, which is this sort of whirling stick with a round bit at the bottom that is like acts like a flywheel, kind of keeps it spinning, a bit like a top. And it's being spun by Adrastea, who is a personification of necessity, Ananke. Sorry, it's being spun by Ananke, like so necessity. And when then suddenly can look down on the whorl of the spindle, he sees that it's a cutout. It's a bit difficult to explain, but if you imagine
I explained it in terms of like concentric like bowls sitting within one another.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a spherical model of the cosmos that's been cut in half, so you can look down into it and see each ring within it, with the Earth at the center. And Plato hints at all these different planetary spheres, and he gives different sizes for them and different colors for them, but it's all very unclear. And Proclus in his commentary says, oh, there's at least 2 different versions of this, and the planetary ordering doesn't match any planetary ordering we know from another source, which in itself doesn't disqualify it, because we have other planetary orderings from antiquity which are just one-offs. There's a lot of planetary orderings out there, the Mithraic ones and so on. So he sees this model of the cosmos, and it's got a harmony of the spheres. Each sphere has a siren sitting on it, and she's singing a note. And because there's 7 spheres in all, you get a nice harmony of the spheres, which is like an entire 7-tone scale. And the 3 fates are sitting around, kind of lending a hand in turning the outermost sphere to keep it moving. And then this kind of herald comes and says, okay, it's time for the fates to give you your next lives. Here's the lots, blah, blah, blah. And then they choose their next lives. And it's a little complicated. But I guess the point I wanted to bring up here is you have this very mysterious and weird excursus into what seems to be cosmic model building. First of all, in the underworld, which is a funny place to have a look at the heavens, isn't it? But then there's reasons for this from the mystery cult traditions and the
that whole thing, I found it so difficult to picture the like topography and what was going on in the myth of Ur when I first heard it. It felt like, again, you're going to the underworld, but you're in heaven. It's a very spacey feel. You're looking at the cosmos. It just felt very like M.C. Escher, impossible geometries, and confusing. And what I did in the podcast is I gave, the ethical message, those interpretations. And in this case, because the myth of Ur section is so long, I just did not include all the tiny details that obviously point to some other interpretation that I knew I wasn't going to have time to get into.
Yeah.
But yeah, this stuff is fascinating. So what do you think he meant by it?
Well, good question. I think here I can maybe give you a better answer. I'm still not going to say what I think Plato means, because I don't get Plato. Someone, I don't know who said it, but someone said that the classical period is the dream time of the modern West. And I think there's something in that. So the dream time is an idea appropriated from Australian Aboriginal peoples who have this idea of the dream time, which is this sort of it's this ancient period where ancestor spirits and sort of quasi godlike beings were kind of roaming the land and doing all kinds of stuff. And I think it's significant that it's the dream time, because, we all know what dream logic is like. In fact, in a dream, you can have an experience quite like the myth of Ur, where you're sort of like, well, it was like I was in New York, but it wasn't New York. And then I went in this train, but then there was a basement in the train, and I went down to the basement and I was at a party, and then I saw my brother, like that kind of crazy dream. That makes sense in the dream. But then when you try to explain it, like philosophers or scholars of philosophy try to say, well, it's clear that Ur must not be looking at actually the cosmic spindle, but at a model of the cosmic spindle, because otherwise how could he be looking down at it? It's like, don't
it's stupid. It's a very stupid thing to say to me.
You know what I mean? Like Plato actually had a diagram in front of him. So think dream logic, and you won't go far wrong when you're looking at any depiction of the other world. That's my other world interpretation rule of Lake. And so my point here is that the underworld or the other world has landmarks, but it doesn't have mappable topography. So that's the kind of space that is in. And in constructing the space in this rather psychedelic and shifting way, where suddenly they're on a plane. You know, he goes to the underworld, that's clear. He descends because he's dead and his soul has left his body. But then he's in this plane there are these gates in the sky and gates in the ground. It's like, wait a minute, I thought you were underground. How can there be a sky? Oh, well, I guess there's a sky. Okay, no problem. That's the kind of thing we're dealing with. And Plato, in doing that, is being really true to this Greek traditional otherworld construction, where the landscape
dream logic of the otherworld.
Totally.
Yeah. I know. Okay, we've been on the phone for a while, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to know if you have a short answer, because if it's not a short answer, like this is, I know, going to be a very, very long answer. But I realize that like we're sitting here and we're talking about all the math stuff in Republic, and we haven't even really talked about the mathematical education of the Guardians. Yeah. Right. And so this is this thing, and you go through and it's, like, what will they learn? Well, the most important subject is arithmetic, and then geometry, and then solid geometry, and then astronomy, which turns out to be geometry because it's astronomy without stars, and then harmony, which turns out to be math because it's ratios. It's ratios without music. Yeah. And so in general, what do you make of that? But also, even just very specifically, the short answer, he says, why should they study arithmetic? And he says, oh, well, because it'll get them thinking about the one and the many. Yeah. What is that?
Okay, well, let me go back to the first thing. Okay. One thing that's interesting in what Plato's doing here is that you start with number, arithmetic, then you move to number in space, geometry,
flat space, yeah.
Flat space. Then you move to number in three-dimensional space, solid geometry. Then you move to number in three-dimensional space and moving, astronomy. Then you move to number in three-dimensional space, movement in time, music, harmony, right? So he's like adding layers each time.
A dimension on each, yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I think, the progression. And what was the next question?
Well, what's the one in the many?
The one in the many. Whoa. So the one in the many is, it can be so many things, but you know that also in Plato's unwritten doctrines, the agrapha dogmata that Aristotle talks about, Plato gives a basic ontology. So he, like all the pre-Socratics who came before him, he asks the question, what is the world made from, right? Thales said water, Anaxagoras said nous, etc. Plato says tohen, the one, and heduos, the dyad, the indefinite dyad, the auristos duos. So that might be what he's talking about. These kind of, in an almost kind of naive way, this belief that the universe arises from actual metaphysical principles, which are the one and the two, or the dyad, which is, once you have two, you have many, right? You have multiplicity. And this, you have to understand Greek numerical theory in this, like, so one is not seen as a number in Greek, in Plato's time. It's seen as like the sort of mother of all numbers, but it's not itself a number. That's important to understand as background. But that's one reading of the one and the many, right? It's knowledge of the ultimate principles of reality. So it's just like saying, it's analogous to a modern physicist saying, if you want to understand the ultimate question of reality, you have to understand the Big Bang or something like that.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
You have to know where
it's like more abstract, the abstract metaphysical Big Bang.
Yeah, except as we know, for Plato, the term abstract's a bit misleading to describe metaphysical realities in Plato, right? Because it's more like this world that we can see and touch is a bit abstract. It's abstracted forms. It's single unities that have been abstracted out into numerous instantiations. But the forms are unified. They're they're the minimal possible number. They're like the point of the pyramid, and we're living at the bottom of the pyramid. So if that makes sense.
There's also something he says about when he's trying to explain, the whole point of this education on the explicit part of it is, well, you want to turn people towards the forms, right? You want to get people wondering and doubting, and they'll start questioning maybe. And so his justification for arithmetic, he's like, don't worry about counting your armies and everything. That's just like pedestrian. What you need to be doing is like thinking about this one-many paradox. And I think he explains something about how if you look at the same thing from doesn't the same thing always look sometimes like one, sometimes like many?
Yeah. And in philosophy, to this day, the problem of one and many remains a huge problem. The problem of universals. It's often talked about as well. There, for example, Socrates paradoxes, which is a very big and potent class of paradoxes, which seem to be kind of very difficult to escape from in any logical system. Which people,
how many grains make a heap?
Yeah, exactly. At what point do you go from having not a heap to a heap? There has to be a point, logically. There has to be some point at which you add one more grain and it's suddenly a heap. And it wasn't a heap before, except you can never really specify that. And that's a kind of illustration of a problem that really does apply to when we talk, like if you talk about a person as being one person, yeah, but you can chop them up into two pieces. Okay, then they're not a person.
But also the heap is still many grains.
Yeah. So problems of one and many, I think, are fundamental problems of logic, and the kind of logic, incidentally, that was very much being done in the Eleatic school of philosophy that we know Plato was so engaged with, Parmenides and Parmenides' followers. So it may be that that's part of the picture here. He's grappling with these logical problems of one and many that those guys have posed. Yeah. What I suggest is you read the Parmenides, Plato's Parmenides, which, like, if you think you don't understand it now, read the Parmenides, and then you'll realize the absolute depths of your ignorance, right? Because he rinses the problem of one and many to the point where you're like, the one exists and doesn't exist, and nothing exists and everything exists, and oneness and manyness, and your head explodes. It's like that. That's what he's aiming for.
Well, I mean, I get a lot of head exploding from Plato, and okay, yeah. One of the things I want to mention is that we were talking about the divided line and how every word and syllable may be intentional in Plato because the Republic is cut into such precise proportions. But reading it, and particularly rewriting it in a way that would be, I thought, listenable for a regular set of ears, even like for my set of ears, unprimed by many years of study and just like pig-headed determination. When you just read the text, it's like, it feels, I can't feel the rhythms of it. It feels like some parts go on forever, some parts are really short, some parts he's just looping around in these arguments that don't make much sense, and I find him incredibly frustrating. So I want to think that, like, you know what, he's a good philosopher, he's just sloppy with some kind of form, he's just like, his pacing is poor.
Yeah.
But I guess it's not. I guess he was just playing an entirely different game that my ears can't hear. I
hear you. I have a theory about that. It's something that's come to me recently on rereading the Republic over the last sort of year. I think his writing process went something along the lines of, and he might have, I do think it's possible that he wrote the Republic. He wrote and rewrote and he sort of added new ideas when he rewrote, so that eventually, because like, you have the tripartite soul, and then he kind of just drops it. And suddenly you have the 4-part cognition. Yeah. And it's like, how does that fit under the tripartite soul? And he even says like 4 parts of the soul. These, so it's like, what? I thought we had 3 parts of the soul.
And he's like, yeah, let's start with the 2 parts of the soul.
Yeah.
You're like, wait, what?
So that being the case, I kind of feel like the way he might have written it, without getting into any details, because we just do not know, and this is completely speculative, is he had structure, he had landmarks, he had, in fact, a structure based on musical theory, which I think Maya Alapin and others are right, that is the basic overarching structure of the Republic, that it's based on these important consonant harmonies, whether intentionally or not, we don't know. And sometimes he's putting in filler material.
Yeah.
He knows he has this many, he's probably dividing it up by lines, which was the normal way to divide up.
I'm just so glad to hear someone else say that.
He's dividing it up by lines. He knows, so what have I done here? Okay, I've done my bit about the divided line, and I need to get to this bit. No, I've done all my amazing images, and now the next big thing is going to be a reference to music. So how do I get there? Okay, well, I'll throw in a bit about, blah blah. So like the bit about the whole attack on Homer, and the problem with Homer, which is so vexing to so many people, because he's throughout the whole Republic, he's quoting Homer all the time and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I love the problem with Homer. Yeah. That's one of my favorite themes of the Republic, actually.
It may be that some of that is just in there because he knows he has like 500 lines to use up to get to the next bit, which has to be placed in a certain spot. So I think there's filler material. I really do. I
mean, I guess it's like almost like the only way to do it if you want to hit these landmarks right on.
Yeah. Could be wrong, but I do, and that would explain the kind of weird impression you get reading it, right? Tell me if you have this impression as well, where you feel like, on the one hand, this is a master at work, and I'm reading like a piece of architecture. On the other hand, he kind of, some of the bits, like the baseboards and some of the cabinets, he kind of didn't do the same quality work on those as he did on the other bits, and he's sort of like fudged a few bits to get the whole thing together. That's the kind of impression I get.
Yeah, that is such a good way to put it, because like some of it is just so precise and so carefully written, it can't be an accident, but so much of it just feels so sloppy and looping that it couldn't be on purpose.
Yeah.
Which may go some way to explaining why I found it so challenging to turn this book into like a radio play that was listenable and comprehensible.
Yeah, well, comprehensible and also kind of pleasant listening, right?
Right.
Because
I mean, the kind of thing that you might listen to if you weren't, being threatened with flunking out of a degree or something like that.
Yeah. And I think, that isn't really what the Republic is. So you're doing something that Plato's not intending. He's intending this thing, putting aside the issue of the esoteric altogether for a minute. He's intending this thing to be difficult and recursive, and it's either a total mess, or what I think is more likely, it's like got all these layers of self-referentiality and self-contradiction, which are meant to bust our minds open and get us not thinking in the terms we think that we are thinking in, and thinking in, outside of all conceivable boxes, especially when he's talking about the good, right?
Yes.
And so
I think that's absolutely right. He's building brain teasers, and the purpose is to, precisely to vex us, as you say. But I read enough times in the secondary person that, Plato's this literary genius. You got to attend to the dramatic movement of the dialogues. And I said, well, maybe it's true. I've never seen anyone attend to the dramatic movement of the dialogues, because they just, they'll say it, but let me actually try to do it. And that's why I decided to like rewrite the thing. And sometimes I was successful, but other times I was like, you know what, this isn't the dramatic movement really isn't the thing. There's all these brain teasers in here as well, and it's hard to do justice to them both.
I like it. I like what you're saying. To reapproach that question though, you've picked, maybe aside from the laws or something like that, you've picked
the worst dialogue.
Yeah, the worst dialogue to do that with. Like, do that with the Euthyphro or the Apology, and it's like a beautiful. The
Phaedrus is cute,
Phaedrus,
just flirting by the river,
and it's a story. It has you can read it at numerous levels. It's got thrills and spills. It's got comedy. It's got the sublime. it kind of has a nice bow tied on the end, and it's not super open-ended, even though it's aporetic in some ways. That's Plato as a dramatist writing a satisfying drama.
Well, yeah, but Good in Theory is a political theory podcast, and so I was asking less which of the dialogues makes the most compelling radio play, and more what's the most compelling and interesting way to present Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do want to ask you one more thing that I think is germane to the whole idea of an esoteric hidden truth in the dialogues that's only seeable by a few or invisible. And that's the analogy that Plato makes or Socrates makes with knowledge and the sun.
Yep.
So the idea is that beholding with your mind the knowledge of the forms is like looking at the sun with your eyes. And what that tells me is that you can't understand them, because we all know that if you stare into the sun, you're not going to be able to see. It's blinding. So that's not the only interpretation. What do you make of this metaphor?
Anything?
Yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting ways you could run with that. What Plato seems to be saying, though, is, or I should say, what Socrates seems to be saying in certain parts of the Republic is that for a very small number of people, you can look at the sun. You can look at the sun of the good. And it's interesting he chooses the sun as a metaphor, because, of course, you can't stare at the sun. You know, when the guys come out of the cave and in this very naturalistic sort of metaphor of the cave.
Yeah.
And he's saying, you know, Glaucon, then they're going to go up this rough and steep ascent, and they're going to come out into the outer world. And at first they're going to be blind, right? And so Glaucon's like, necessarily, Socrates. And then, but isn't it logical to think, Glaucon, that they're then going to start to look at indirect things,
shadows and reflections,
and then they'll be able to look at actual things, and then finally they'll be able to stare directly at the sun itself. And it's like, hang on a minute, no one can stare directly at the sun; it'll burn your eyes out. Like, that's a bizarre metaphor. Is that bizarre because he's just not being naturalistic? We're supposed to be thinking in terms of a kind of again, like a dream logic, or is he intentionally putting in this weird, like, kind of reference to a transcendence of the human condition? It's like, what if there were someone who could stare at the sun? Obviously that would be someone very special indeed, someone who can actually
I always just assumed that was one of those times he's stating the impossibility of it, right?
Maybe
he's like, what it would mean to understand the form of the good is what it would mean to be able to stare in the sun, which is like humans can't do it.
Possibly.
Or you could say, like, humans, it's not possible in the physical world because of our bodies, but maybe you can do it.
Yeah. Maybe the souls can. Right.
Yeah.
That's one possible reading for sure. It's certainly emphasizing that it's not going to be, I mean, it's when I say it's not going to be easy, I mean, it's really not going to be easy.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about superhuman beings who've transcended what it is to be what's normally thought about being a human being, right? And when he talks about the highest segment of the divided line, whether that be the big one or the little one, Socrates says, and as for the highest one, you know what? Well, let's move on.
Yeah.
So
you wouldn't get it anyway.
Yeah, you wouldn't get it anyway. Let's move on to something else. So if that isn't a kind of little tease, like a very significant tease at an empty space in the dialogue that you're being invited to fill, I don't know what is.
Well, I mean, funny you should pick exactly that language, because, like, as I said, my episode on that section of the book was called Horny for the Good. And the kind of way I think about it sometimes is that there are philosophers who want to tell you something, and there are philosophers who want to get you questioning. There are philosophers who are about satisfaction or desire, the ones who are like about the nut or the boner. And as far as I can tell, Socrates is all about the boner, right? That's why he brings Glaucon right to the edge, and Glaucon's literally yelling like, "Tell me, by Apollo, tell me what the form of the good is." He's like, "Nah, I can't."
Socrates is literally about the boner if you read the Symposium.
Yeah, exactly. It's
like, it's not even you don't even, that's actually a really good metaphor, because it's not even a metaphor. He's when what's his name, you know,
Alcibiades
says, this one time Socrates and I were in bed all night, and I was like all like rubbing up against him and trying to get him to, and Socrates was as cool as a cucumber, never nutted.
Yeah. Like, that's really part of the appeal of Plato. And that is why I'm always suspicious of all this esoteric stuff. That's why I'm always like, you know what? Is he signaling this vast underground world of happiness? Or is he being a tease? Which certainly he's also that, at least.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I don't answer it. I don't have an answer myself. And the reason I don't have an answer is because Plato is in the dream time. His way of thinking, the fundamental way he thinks, the fundamental way he uses language is so different from modern ways of thinking that I can't really enter into it. And Plotinus, who writes in the 3rd century CE, who has a extremely abstruse, highly apophatic take on the highest reality, which is the one, which of course he finds in Plato, esoterically expressed in the dialogues. It's incredibly difficult. He says on numerous occasions, I can't put it into words, no one can, it's beyond the human ken. I still totally get him more on the one than I get Plato on just normal talk about forms and stuff like that. Because Plotinus is recognizably thinking in terms that are much more similar to modern ways of thinking than Plato. So yeah.
Shall we conclude on that note of bafflement and the impossibility of ever glimpsing the depths of our hero Plato?
I like it. It's always good to end on a note of bafflement.
And what is it? Is your tagline? Till next time, stay esoteric?
Yeah, in this case, I would say even be like the eternal reputation of Plato as a literary craftsman and philosopher par excellence, and stay esoteric.
Thank you very much, Earl.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man. It's been a delight chatting with you about this stuff.
Thank you, of course, to Earl Fontainelle for being our guest on the show. You can find his podcast on your podcast app or at SHWEP.net. Also, special thanks to Simon Dixon and Marie for deciding to support Good in Theory on Patreon. If you want to do the same, go to patreon.com/goodintheory. You can find us there. And if you've been listening for a while and you think you're getting anything out of the show, learning something, then remember, you can help other people find it by leaving us a rating or review. Thanks again. See you next time.